Soul Harvest. Chapter 1. The Stranger's Arrival. The endless cornfields stretched beneath the late autumn sky, the golden stalks swaying under the cold breath of a northern wind. This was Enoch's farm, isolated, vast, and eerily quiet except for the rustling of crops. The nearest town lay miles away, and the road to get there was more a memory of gravel than an actual path. Only a few dared to travel this far into the forgotten lands of Nebraska. But today someone came. Sara, the youngest of the Ellsworths, stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, staring at the silhouette in the distance. The figure moved slowly but deliberately, cutting a path through the cornfield. From where she stood, Sara couldn't make out any details, but her heart raced all the same. The man, for she assumed it was a man by the gate, was too far from any main road to be a casual passerby. Something wasn't right. "Ma!" Sara shouted over her shoulder, her eyes never leaving the figure. "There's someone coming." Her mother, Lucille, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, and squinted toward the horizon. "Ain't no one supposed to be out here." Her voice was calm but strained, carrying the weight of years living in fear of unexpected visitors. Could be a drifter, or worse. The words hung between them. Sara swallowed hard, her hand gripping the rough wood of the railing. Out here, on the edge of nowhere, the arrival of a stranger rarely meant anything good. Minutes passed as the figure drew closer, revealing more details with each step. The man wore a long, tattered coat, its edges torn and dirty, and his face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he were dragging himself forward with a hidden burden. When he finally reached the front yard, Sara noticed something strange. His eyes, dark, hollow, like he hadn't slept in days, stared straight ahead, unblinking. There was no warmth in them, only a cold, unsettling emptiness. "Afternoon," Lucille greeted, her voice tight as she stepped forward. "What brings you out this way?" The man didn't answer at first. He simply stood there, the wind whistling between them. Then, in a voice as dry as the dust under his feet, he rasped, "The harvest." Lucille's brow furrowed. "The harvest's done. We just finished gathering the last of the crops. Ain't nothing left to pick." The man's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Not that harvest." Sara felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his voice, something that didn't belong in the realm of the living. "Then what are you talking about?" Lucille asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the question itself could summon some unseen terror. The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "The harvest of souls." Sara's breath caught in her throat. Lucille took a step back, her eyes narrowing. "You best be on your way," she warned, her voice now carrying a sharper edge. "Ain't nobody here for you." But the man remained still, his shadow growing long in the fading light. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when they do, there'll be no hiding." Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the cornfield, his form swallowed by the endless sea of stalks. Sara stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. Who was he? And what did he mean by the harvest of souls? Lucille grabbed Sara's arm, pulling her toward the house. "Get inside. Lock the doors." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in darkness, Sara couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than any stranger had come to Enoch's farm. The night would bring answers whether they wanted them or not. Something strange is happening at the farm. Who was the stranger? And what terrible truth lies hidden in the cornfields? Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe for more. Chapter 2. The Silent Cornfield. The farmhouse creaked under the weight of the wind as Sara and Lucille sat inside, eyes locked on the windows. Outside, the cornfields were still, too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The stranger's words replayed in Sara's mind. like a scratched record stuck on an ominous note. "They're coming," she whispered to herself, her fingers nervously tapping the worn wood of the dining table. Lucille, who had always been the bedrock of the family, seemed shaken in a way that Sara had never seen before. Her mother stared out the window, her jaw clenched, and her hands busy with a rosary she hadn't touched in years. "It's probably nothing," Lucille said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just a crazy man passing through." But Sara didn't believe it. There was something about the way the stranger spoke, the way his hollow eyes had seemed to peer into her soul, that left her unsettled. There had been a weight to his words, a promise of something far worse than a simple vagabond's ramblings. The sun had fully set now, and the house was bathed in shadows. Only the flickering light from the fireplace offered any comfort, but it seemed dim, as though the darkness was closing in around them. Lucille stood and moved toward the door, checking the locks again for what felt like the 100th time. "Ma," Sara asked, breaking the silence. "What do you think he meant?" Lucille paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. "I don't know, honey, but I'll tell you one thing. If there's anyone coming for us, they won't find us unprepared." She turned and headed toward the kitchen. Sara heard the metallic clink of the drawer opening, followed by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being loaded. The air inside the farmhouse grew thick with tension as the hours stretched on. Midnight came and went, and with it the first sound, an unnatural rustling from the cornfield. Sara's head snapped up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ma, do you hear that?" Lucille froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, a soft but persistent rustling, like something moving through the stalks, slowly but purposefully. It wasn't the wind. Sara knew that much. This sound had an intent behind it, a creeping, crawling presence that made her skin crawl. Lucille moved toward the window and cautiously peeked outside. Her face paled, and she stepped back, gripping the shotgun tighter. "Stay away from the windows," she commanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Sara, her body trembling, forced herself to approach the window and look out. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. But then, just at the edge of the cornfield, she saw movement, shadows twisting and writhing just beyond the reach of the porch light. It wasn't animals. The shapes were too tall, too human-like. They were coming, and they weren't alone. What are the shadows lurking in the cornfields? Is it just the wind, or something much darker? Stay tuned for more, and subscribe to find out. Chapter 3. The Haunting Shadows. The air inside the farmhouse became suffocating as the strange rustling from the cornfields grew louder. Sara stood frozen by the window, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the shifting figures just beyond the porch. They moved like shadows, humanoid yet not quite real. Each step they took was deliberate, creeping closer through the maze of cornstalks. Lucille grabbed Sara by the shoulder, yanking her away from the window. "We stay together," she ordered, her voice thick with fear but also resolve. "No matter what happens, you stay close to me." Sara nodded, her body shaking uncontrollably. "What are they, Ma?" Her voice cracked as she asked, the terror clawing at her insides. Lucille didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept her eyes on the door, gripping the shotgun tightly. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "But whatever they are, they ain't here for no good." A loud thud echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Sara's heart leaped into her throat. Someone, or something, was standing right outside their door. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, everything went deathly quiet. Then came the knock. It was a slow, deliberate tapping, not frantic or demanding, but patient like whoever or whatever was knocking had all the time in the world. "Don't answer it," Lucille whispered, her voice tense. "Whatever you do, don't open that door." Sara nodded, backing away as Lucille aimed the shotgun at the front entrance. The knocking continued, slow and steady, as if the thing outside knew they were inside, waiting, watching. Sara's breath hitched as a soft voice called from behind the door, a voice that made her blood run cold. "Let us in." It was the voice of a child. No, more than one. It was several voices, layered and unnatural, blending together in a chorus that sent chills down Sara's spine. "Let us in, we're cold, we're hungry." Lucille's grip tightened on the shotgun, her knuckles white. "Sara, get back. Stay behind me." But Sara couldn't move. The voices were hypnotic, beckoning her forward despite her terror. She felt her feet inching closer to the door, drawn by some invisible force. Her mind screamed for her to stop, but her body refused to listen. "Sara!" Lucille snapped, yanking her back just as Sara's hand reached for the doorknob. "Don't you dare!" The voices outside grew more insistent. "Please, let us in. We're lost." Lucille fired a warning shot, the blast echoing through the house. The voices stopped abruptly, and the only sound left was the heavy breathing of mother and daughter. For a moment, Sara thought it was over. Maybe the shot had scared them away. But then, the entire house shook with a violent force. The door rattled in its frame as if something massive was trying to break through. The windows trembled, and the floorboards groaned under the strain. Sara screamed, backing away toward the stairs. Lucille stood her ground, aiming the shotgun at the door, but her hands were trembling. "They're inside the corn," Lucille shouted over the noise. "They're in the ground itself." Just as suddenly as it began, the shaking stopped. The house fell into a deathly silence. Lucille's breath came in ragged gasps, and Sara clung to the banister, her heart racing. For a long moment, neither of them moved, afraid that even the slightest sound would provoke another attack. Then, from outside, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the night. It was soft at first, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a sinister undercurrent that turned the innocent sound into something horrifying. Lucille stepped back from the door, her face pale and drawn. "It ain't just the harvest they're after." Sara swallowed hard. "Then what?" Lucille's voice dropped to a whisper. "They want us." The knocking has stopped, but the danger hasn't. What lies beneath the cornfields, and what do these shadowy figures really want? Stay tuned. Subscribe to uncover the chilling truth. Chapter 4. The Unmarked Grave. The laughter from outside slowly faded, but the terror in the farmhouse lingered. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind outside sent Sara's heart pounding in her chest. Lucille stepped away from the door, her face tight with fear and exhaustion. She set the shotgun down on the dining table and sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "I don't understand what's happening," she muttered. "This farm's been here for generations, and nothing like this has ever happened before." Sara's eyes darted to the window, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You don't think it's got something to do with the land, do you? I mean, those things came from the cornfields." Lucille looked up, her brow furrowed. "The land?" She trailed off, a look of dawning horror crossing her face. No, it couldn't be." "What, Ma? What couldn't be?" Lucille stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I've got to check something," she said, her voice shaking. "Stay here. Don't move." Sara watched in confusion as her mother hurried toward the cellar door. Lucille paused for a moment, then descended into the basement, leaving Sara alone in the flickering light of the fireplace. The house groaned again, settling into an uneasy quiet. Minutes ticked by, each one slower than the last, until finally, Lucille reappeared, clutching something in her hands. A crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. Her eyes were wide with fear as she unfolded it and placed it on the table in front of Sara. "What's that?" Sara asked, leaning forward to look. Lucille swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a map of the farm, but not just the farm. The burial grounds." Sara's eyes widened. "Burial grounds?" Lucille nodded grimly. "Your granddaddy, Enoch, he never told anyone about this. I only found out after he passed, when I found this map hidden in the cellar. There's an unmarked grave out there, beneath the cornfields. Something terrible must have happened a long time ago." The color drained from Sara's face. "You mean The bodies are still out there? Lucille nodded again, her face ashen. I think whatever's out there, whatever's haunting us, it's them. Sara's stomach churned. What do we do? How do we stop it? Lucille shook her head. I don't know. But one thing's for sure, we need to find that grave. The past is haunting them, and the answers lie buried beneath the cornfields. What dark secrets will they uncover in the unmarked grave? Subscribe to see what happens next. Chapter 5. Beneath the Earth. The cold night air hit Sara and Lucille like a slap as they stepped off the porch and into the vast expanse of the cornfields. Lucille held a flashlight in one hand and the shotgun in the other, while Sara carried the map, her fingers trembling as she tried to make sense of the faded lines and markings. The wind was still, and the only sound came from their feet crunching over the dry, brittle soil. They ventured deeper into the cornfield, the tall stalks towering over them, casting long shadows under the moonlight. Each step felt like a descent into something ancient and sinister, as if the very earth beneath their feet was alive with dark memories. The corn rustled faintly, even though there was no wind. Lucille shone the flashlight ahead, illuminating the path marked on the old map. It should be just up ahead, she muttered, her voice tense. We're close. Sara's pulse quickened. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became, as though the weight of the land's history was pressing down on them, warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Not when they were so close to the truth. They reached a clearing, an empty patch of earth in the middle of the field where no corn grew. It was as if the land had refused to yield here, a stark, barren contrast to the fertile soil all around them. Lucille's flashlight beams swept over the ground, revealing a patch of disturbed dirt, as though something had recently been unearthed. Sara's throat tightened. This is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. This is where they're buried. Lucille nodded, her jaw clenched. She stepped forward, kneeling by the disturbed soil, her fingers brushing over the ground. I can feel it, she said softly. Something's wrong here, something evil. As if in response, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the corn, making the stalks hiss and sway violently. The air turned icy, and the oppressive feeling that had been hanging over them intensified. Sara shivered, backing away instinctively. Ma, we shouldn't be here. We need to go. But Lucille shook her head. Not yet. We have to make this right. Whatever your granddaddy did, whatever he buried here, it's what's haunting us. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. Sara yelped, stumbling backward as the earth began to tremble. Lucille gasped, clutching the shotgun tightly. The dirt in the center of the clearing began to rise, as though something beneath the surface was pushing its way up. Sara's eyes widened in horror. Ma, what is that? Lucille backed away, her face pale as the soil continued to shift and crack. Oh God, she whispered. They're waking up. Before their eyes, the dirt collapsed inward, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the earth. From the depths of the pit, a skeletal hand reached out, clawing its way toward the surface. Then another, and another. Sara screamed, her voice echoing through the night. Ma, we have to run. But Lucille stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock as more hands emerged from the earth, pulling themselves up. The figures were grotesque, half-rotted corpses with hollow eyes and tattered clothing, their flesh hanging loosely from their bones. They dragged themselves out of the grave, one by one, their mouths twisted into grim, silent screams. Lucille finally snapped out of her trance, grabbing Sara's arm and pulling her back. Run, she shouted. Get back to the house. They turned and bolted through the cornfield, the sound of shuffling footsteps and cracking bones following close behind them. The figures moved slowly, but there were so many, dozens of them, maybe more, all crawling out of the unmarked grave. Sara's lungs burned as she ran, her heart racing with pure terror. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, but it felt impossibly far away. Behind them, the dead were coming. As they reached the edge of the field, Sara chanced a glance over her shoulder and froze. The figures had stopped at the edge of the clearing, standing motionless in the moonlight. They didn't follow into the corn, as if bound to the patch of land where they had been buried. Lucille skidded to a halt beside her, breathing heavily. "Why aren't they following us?" Sara shook her head, her chest heaving with exertion. "I don't know. Maybe they can't leave the grave." Lucille's eyes narrowed. "Or maybe they're waiting for something." Just then, the wind died down, and an eerie silence fell over the fields. From deep within the cornfield, a low voice drifted through the air. A voice Sara recognized immediately. It was the stranger from earlier, the man with the hollow eyes. "They won't come for you," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "But you will come to them." Sara's heart sank as the realization hit her. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The dead have risen, but something even darker awaits. What is the stranger's true purpose? And how will they stop the horrors buried beneath Enoch's farm? Subscribe to discover the chilling conclusion. Chapter 6. The Final Truth. The farmhouse came into view, its weathered frame barely holding up under the weight of decades of storms and secrets. Lucille and Sara stumbled onto the porch, their breath ragged, their bodies aching with exhaustion. Behind them, the figures stood at the edge of the cornfield, unmoving, as though the very soil held them in place. "We can't stay here," Sara gasped, clutching the banister. "They'll come for us eventually. I know it." Lucille nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon, but there was no escaping the inevitable. "They won't stop," she muttered. "Not until the debt is paid." "What debt?" Sara demanded, frustration and fear mixing in her voice. "What does that even mean?" Lucille looked at her, her face lined with grief and something else. "Guilt. Your granddaddy, he made a pact, long before you were born. This land, this farm, it's cursed, Sara. He didn't just bury bodies out there. He buried a deal." Sara's blood turned to ice. "A deal? What kind of deal?" Lucille's voice dropped to a whisper. "To protect the family. To keep the farm alive no matter the cost." But the cost wasn't paid in full. And now the debt's come due. Sara's heart pounded. What do they want? How do we stop this? Lucille shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "We can't stop it. We can only survive it." Before Sara could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. The porch rattled, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the fields. The figures had begun moving again, slowly making their way toward the house. "They're coming," Lucille whispered. Sara gripped her mother's hand, fear threatening to consume her. "What do we do?" Lucille looked toward the barn, where an old rusted plow stood. "There's only one way to end this. The pact was made with blood, and it'll take blood to break it." Sara's stomach twisted. "Whose blood?" Lucille met her gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Ours." The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.